My wife told me she only married me because I reminded her of her dead ex-boyfriend. She said it during our worst fight, 3 years into what I thought was a happy marriage. We were standing in our kitchen arguing about money, when suddenly Natalie's face crumpled and the words spilled out like poison she'd been holding back. I never loved you, David. You just looked like him. You reminded me of Kyle. The silence that followed felt like falling into a grave. I stared at her across our granite countertop, trying to process what she'd just admitted. Kyle. The name she'd mentioned maybe 5 times in 3 years, always with tears in her eyes, always followed by, he died in a car accident before we could get married. I'd been sympathetic, supportive, understanding about her grief. I thought I was helping her heal. What do you mean I reminded you of him? My voice came out hollow, like it belonged to someone else. Natalie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and walked to our bedroom. She returned with a shoebox I'd never seen before, hands shaking as she pulled out photographs. The man staring back at me had my face. Not similar features, not a general resemblance. My exact face, down to the scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood fall. Same dark hair, same jawline, same brown eyes. We could have been identical twins separated at birth. The photos showed Kyle laughing, kissing Natalie, wearing clothes that could have been pulled from my own closet. How is this possible? I whispered, holding a picture of Kyle at what looked like the same coffee shop where Natalie and I had our first date. She was sobbing now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streams. I saw you at that bookstore and I couldn't breathe. You looked exactly like him. I followed you for 3 blocks. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Our meet-cute wasn't cute at all. She'd stalked me because I resembled a dead man. Our first conversation, our first kiss, our wedding day, all of it built on her desperate need to resurrect someone who was gone forever. I was a living memorial to Kyle Thompson. So, our entire relationship is what exactly? I asked, my hands shaking as I set down the photographs. A grief experiment? 3 years of you pretending I'm someone else? Natalie reached for me, but I stepped backward. The woman I'd married was a stranger who'd been using me as a replacement part for her broken heart. She tried to explain through her tears. How she'd planned to tell me eventually, once she'd processed her grief properly. How she did care about me, even if it started for the wrong reasons. But every word made it worse. I wasn't David Mitchell to her. I was Kyle Thompson with a different name and social security number. I spent that night in our guest room, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of our relationship through this new lens. The way she'd sometimes call me by the wrong name during sex, quickly correcting herself. Her insistence on certain restaurants and activities that seemed random, but now made perfect sense. She'd been recreating her life with Kyle, using me as a stand-in. The strange phone calls started making sense too. Natalie would get calls at odd hours and step outside to talk, always returning emotional and distant. When I'd asked about them, she'd claimed they were grief counselors or old friends checking on her. Now, I wondered who was really on the other end of those calls. The next morning, I started going through our financial records while Natalie was at work. I needed to understand the scope of her deception, to see how deep this obsession went. What I found in our bank statements made my stomach turn. Monthly payments of $200 to something called Healing Hearts Support Services, going back to before we even met. But that wasn't all. There were other suspicious payments. A private investigator named Robert Vance had received $500 monthly for 6 months during our first year of dating. When I called his office, his secretary confirmed they'd provided background research and surveillance services for a female client matching Natalie's description. I called the number listed on the bank statements for Healing Hearts. A cheerful woman answered, "Healing Hearts, this is Margaret speaking." When I asked about Natalie's payments, Margaret's voice became cautious. "Are you her spouse?" she asked. "We typically only discuss member information with their partners if they're part of our extended support network." "Extended support network?" I pressed. Margaret explained that Healing Hearts helped people dealing with the loss of significant others, and many members found it beneficial when their new partners understood the grieving process. She offered to send me literature about supporting someone through complicated grief, which felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But something about her phrasing bothered me. "How many other spouses are in this extended network?" I asked. Margaret paused for a long moment before saying, "Well, we have several couples where both partners participate in our programming. Would you like to schedule a consultation?" The way she said it suggested this was common, routine even. I drove to the address listed for Healing Hearts, expecting to find a therapist's office or grief counseling center. Instead, I found a small community center with a sign advertising, "Private Event, Healing Hearts, Thursday, meeting 7 p.m. It was 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, which meant I had 4 hours to decide whether to confront Natalie or investigate further. While waiting, I decided to look deeper into Kyle Thompson's death. The obituary was easy to find online, dated 3 years and 4 months ago. Kyle Thompson, 28, died in a single car accident on Highway 92 during a rainstorm. Survived by his parents, Margaret and Robert Thompson, and his fiancée, Natalie Chen. No other family members were listed. The funeral home's website had a memorial page with photos and comments from mourners. What struck me was how many women had left messages, all expressing deep personal loss. Kyle meant everything to me. wrote someone named Rachel Kim. My heart died with you, posted Angela Wu. Linda Park had written, you promised we'd be together forever. These weren't casual friends expressing sympathy. I chose investigation. That evening, I parked across the street from the community center and waited. At 6:45, women started arriving. Young women, middle-aged women, all carrying photos in small frames. I counted 12 women entering the building, including my wife. They looked like they were going to a memorial service, not a support group. Through the windows, I could see them sitting in a circle, holding up their framed photographs. The meeting went on for 2 hours, with women taking turns speaking and others nodding sympathetically. It looked like any grief support group, except for one disturbing detail I noticed as they began to leave. Several of the women were comparing photos, pointing at similarities between the men in the pictures. What made it worse was that some of the women weren't holding photos of Kyle. They had pictures of other men who all shared Kyle's basic features. Dark hair, brown eyes, similar facial structure. It was like looking at a catalog of the same person photographed at different angles. I followed one of the women, a blonde in her 30s, to a nearby coffee shop where she met with another woman from the group. They sat in a corner booth, and I positioned myself at a table close enough to overhear their conversation. What I heard made my blood run cold. Michael still doesn't know, the blonde was saying. I mean, he knows about Kyle, but he doesn't know about the others. Others? The second woman asked. How many others have you found? The blonde pulled out her phone and showed pictures. 4 so far. The guy who works at the bank looks exactly like Kyle from the side, and there's a teacher at Roosevelt Elementary who could be his brother. I've been watching them, learning their routines. The second woman leaned forward eagerly. Have you made contact yet? The blonde shook her head. Margaret says I need to be patient. Build a proper backstory first. Create the right circumstances for a natural meeting. She's helped 3 other women find their matches this year alone. My hands were shaking as I realized what I was hearing. These women weren't just grieving their dead boyfriends. They were actively hunting for men who looked like them. The support group was a networking opportunity for finding replacement boyfriends who matched their lost loves. I waited until they left, then approached the barista. Those 2 women who just left, I said casually. They seemed upset. Everything okay? The barista, a young guy with multiple piercings, shrugged. They come in here every Thursday after their meeting, always talking about their dead boyfriends and the guys they're dating now. Kind of weird, but they tip well. Their dead boyfriends? I pressed. The barista nodded. Yeah. Apparently they all lost someone who looked the same or something. They show each other pictures of their current boyfriends and compare them to the dead guys. It's like they're collecting them or something. My stomach dropped. This wasn't grief counseling. It was organized stalking. I drove home in a daze, trying to process what I'd learned. Natalie was part of a group of women who were systematically finding and dating men who resembled their deceased partners. But that raised an even more disturbing question. How many men in our city were unknowingly living as substitutes for dead boyfriends? Natalie was asleep when I got home, but her purse was on the kitchen counter. I felt like a criminal as I went through it, but I needed answers. Inside her wallet, behind her credit cards, I found a small piece of paper with 6 names written in her handwriting. David Mitchell was at the top of the list, with a check mark next to it. The other 5 names had addresses, but there was more. A business card for the private investigator, Robert Vance, with a handwritten note on the back. Subjects 2 to 6 approved for approach. Subject 1 shows excellent compatibility markers. Subject 1 had to be me. The clinical language made me feel like a laboratory specimen. I recognized one of the addresses. It was 3 blocks from our house, the home of a man I'd seen jogging in our neighborhood, Tom Brenner. I'd always thought he looked familiar, but now I understood why. We looked enough alike to be brothers, both matching whatever template Kyle Thompson had left behind. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to Tom's address. He was leaving for work, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase, and the resemblance was unmistakable. Same height, same build, same general features. I followed him to his office building and waited in the lobby until he came down for lunch. Excuse me, I said, approaching him near the elevators. This might sound strange, but do you know a woman named Rachel Kim? Tom's face went pale. How do you know Rachel? He asked, his voice tight with suspicion. She's my wife. Why? The way he said it confirmed my worst fears. Rachel was one of the women from the support group. I suggested we grab coffee, and Tom agreed, looking shaken. Over lattes at a crowded cafe, I told him about Natalie's confession and what I'd discovered about healing hearts. Tom listened with growing horror, occasionally touching his face as if confirming his own features. Rachel told me I reminded her of her ex-boyfriend who died, he said quietly. His name was Kyle. Kyle Thompson? I asked. Tom nodded. She showed me pictures. The resemblance was incredible, but I thought it was just one of those weird coincidences. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of Rachel. She was the blonde from the coffee shop, the one who'd been talking about finding 4 other Kyle lookalikes. We spent 2 hours comparing our experiences. Both of our wives had found us in public places and initiated contact. Both had moved the relationships along quickly, pushing for commitment before we had time to think clearly. Both had monthly payments to Healing Hearts and regular Thursday evening therapy sessions. There's something else, Tom said, pulling out his phone. Rachel's been taking photos of me constantly since we got married. She says it's because she loves me, but she has hundreds of photos from every angle, like she's documenting something. He showed me his phone's photo stream, hundreds of pictures of himself, often when he was unaware he was being photographed. Tom suggested we contact the other men on Natalie's list. If this was as widespread as it seemed, there might be 4 other men living as unknowing substitutes for the same dead boyfriend. The thought was nauseating, but we needed to know the truth. We split the list and agreed to meet again the next evening. My 2 assigned names led me to Stephen Park, a high school teacher, and James Wu, a bank manager. Stephen was easier to approach since he worked at a public school. I waited in the parking lot after school hours and intercepted him as he walked to his car. "Are you married to Linda Park?" I asked. The look of recognition and fear that crossed his face told me everything. Stephen invited me to his classroom where we could talk privately. His story was even more disturbing than mine and Tom's. "Linda didn't just tell me I looked like her dead boyfriend," he said, showing me photos on his phone. "She's been gradually changing my appearance to match his more closely. New haircut, different style of glasses, even convinced me to get a tattoo that matches one Kyle had. The before and after photos were shocking. Stephen 3 years ago looked similar to Kyle, but Stephen today was nearly identical. Linda had systematically transformed her husband into a replica of her dead boyfriend, and he'd gone along with it thinking it was normal couple behavior. James was trickier, but I managed to catch him during his lunch break at a restaurant near the bank. When I mentioned his wife Angela, he immediately wanted to know how I knew her. By the end of our conversation, both men had agreed to meet with Tom and me. They'd both been told they resembled dead boyfriends named Kyle Thompson, but James had the most chilling revelation of all. "Angela's been trying to get pregnant since our wedding day," he said, his voice shaking. "She talks about wanting Kyle's baby, about how our child would be Kyle's legacy. She's been taking fertility drugs without telling me, putting them in my food to increase my sperm count." Thursday evening, 4 men sat in Tom's living room staring at each other like we were looking in funhouse mirrors. We all had the same basic features, the same height and build, the same dark hair and brown eyes. We could have been cousins, or the same person photographed at different angles. The women in our lives had collected us like trophies. Stephen was the most shaken by our meeting. His wife Linda had been particularly aggressive about changing his appearance, buying him clothes that matched photos of Kyle, encouraging him to grow his hair out to match Kyle's style. "She's basically been turning me into a dead person," he said, his voice breaking. 3 years of marriage, and I've been playing dress-up as her ex-boyfriend. But Stephen had discovered something else during his own investigation. "Linda has a storage unit," he said. "I followed her there last month when she said she was going grocery shopping. It's full of Kyle's things. Clothes, furniture, personal items. She's been recreating his apartment piece by piece in that storage unit." James had a different, but equally disturbing story. His wife Angela had been trying to get pregnant immediately after their wedding, talking obsessively about wanting a baby that looked like Kyle. "She has names picked out already," he said quietly. "Kyle Jr., or Kyle if it's a boy, Kylie if it's a girl. She wants to raise Kyle's children with someone who looks like Kyle." Tom revealed that Rachel had been secretly recording their intimate moments. "I found cameras hidden in our bedroom," he said. "When I confronted her, she said she wanted to preserve our memories, but she's been comparing the recordings to old videos she has of Kyle. She rates my performance based on how similar it is to his." The pattern was becoming clear. These women weren't just finding men who looked like Kyle. They were actively trying to transform us into perfect replicas of him. Our personalities, our appearances, even our sexual behavior was being molded to match their memories of a dead man. We decided to confront our wives together, to document what we'd discovered and force them to explain themselves. Tom suggested we attend the next Healing Hearts meeting as a group to see the full scope of what these women were doing. The idea terrified me, but I knew we needed evidence of the systematic nature of their deception. But first, we needed to understand more about Kyle Thompson himself. Stephen, being a teacher, had access to research databases that the rest of us didn't. He spent the next few days digging into Kyle's background, and what he found was even more disturbing than we'd imagined. Kyle Thompson was a psychology graduate student specializing in attachment theory and relationship manipulation, Stephen reported when we met again. His master's thesis was about creating emotional dependency in romantic partners. He was essentially studying how to make women obsessively attached to him. The academic papers Kyle had published painted a picture of a sophisticated manipulator who understood exactly how to exploit vulnerable women. His research focused on women who had experienced previous relationship trauma, showing how they could be conditioned to transfer their emotional needs onto new partners who resembled their lost loves. "There's more," Stephen continued. "Kyle was seeing multiple women simultaneously during his graduate program. His professor's notes mentioned concerns about his unethical application of research methods to personal relationships. He was essentially running psychological experiments on his girlfriends. James had been investigating the financial side of things through his banking connections. The insurance payouts from Kyle's death totaled over $400,000, he reported. But here's the weird part. All the policies were taken out in the 6 months before he died. Someone knew he was going to die and made sure his girlfriends would be financially rewarded for their loss. The following Thursday, 4 men who looked like the same person walked into the community center where 12 women were holding photographs of Kyle Thompson. The room fell silent as we entered, women's faces cycling through recognition, panic, and calculation. Natalie stood up slowly, her face white as she realized her carefully constructed world was collapsing. "Ladies," Tom said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "we need to talk about Kyle." Several women started crying immediately. Others looked angry, as if we'd invaded their private grief ritual. But a few looked calculating, like they were trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, or silence us permanently. Margaret, the woman I'd spoken to on the phone, stepped forward. She was older than the others, maybe 55, with gray hair and kind eyes that looked anything but kind now. "You shouldn't be here," she said firmly. "This is a private support group for people processing grief. Your presence is disruptive to the healing process." "Healing process?" Stephen laughed bitterly. "You mean the process of collecting men who look like your dead boyfriend?" He pulled out his phone and showed a photo of himself from 3 years ago, then a recent photo. The transformation was dramatic. Linda had systematically changed his appearance to match Kyle's look in the photographs. Margaret's composure cracked. "Kyle was a special person," she said, her voice shaking. "He meant something different to each of us. When he died, we lost our futures. These relationships help us process that loss." The plural caught my attention immediately. Kyle hadn't just been dating Natalie. He'd been involved with multiple women simultaneously. "How many of you were dating Kyle when he died?" I asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. Slowly, hands began to rise. 8 of the 12 women had been in relationships with Kyle Thompson at the time of his death. He hadn't been Natalie's devoted boyfriend. He'd been running a sophisticated operation, managing multiple relationships with women who thought they were his only love. The revelation shifted something in the room. Several of the women looked at each other with dawning recognition, realizing they'd all been deceived by the same man. But instead of anger at Kyle's memory, they turned their fury on us. "You're ruining everything," one woman said, her voice rising to a shriek. "You gave us back what he took from us." "We gave you nothing," James said firmly. "You stole our lives, our identities, our futures. You made us into living memorials for a man who was cheating on all of you." The words hit like physical blows. Several women were sobbing now, but their tears looked more like rage than grief. That's when Margaret dropped the first bomb. "Kyle isn't dead," she said quietly, and the room exploded into chaos. Women screamed, some in denial, others in fury. Tom grabbed my arm, and I could see the same thought in his eyes. We needed to get out of there immediately, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Kyle Thompson faked his death," she continued, her voice cutting through the noise. "He's been living in Oregon under a different name. He knows about all of you, about this group, about the men you've married. He's been advising us." The word advising came out like a confession, and suddenly everything made sense. The support group wasn't just women processing grief. It was being orchestrated by the man they were supposedly mourning. Kyle had manipulated 12 women into believing he was dead, then guided them toward finding and marrying men who looked like him. But why? What was the endgame of such an elaborate deception? "Where is he?" Natalie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret looked around the room at the chaos she'd unleashed, then pulled out her phone. "I'll call him," she said. "He should explain this himself." But as she dialed, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Kyle's name appeared on the screen. Margaret put the call on speaker, and Kyle's voice filled the room. "I see you've met the husbands," he said, sounding amused rather than concerned. "This was inevitable eventually. I'm surprised it took 3 years for them to figure it out." His casual tone suggested he'd been monitoring our investigations, possibly through the women themselves. "Kyle," Natalie said, and her voice broke on his name. "Why did you do this to us?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Because I could," he said simply. "Because 12 women loved me enough to reshape their entire lives around my memory. That's power most men can only dream of." The admission was chilling in its honesty. Kyle had orchestrated this entire situation as an ego trip, a way to extend his control over these women even after his supposed death. The men they'd married weren't replacements. We were props in Kyle's ongoing psychological manipulation of his former girlfriends. "The life insurance money was just the beginning," Kyle continued, his voice carrying clearly through the speaker. 12 policies, 12 grieving beneficiaries, and 12 new relationships that I helped arrange. You've all been living in a story I wrote, and you've been paying me for the privilege." The financial angle suddenly became clear. These women had been funding Kyle's new life with their insurance payouts and monthly contributions to Healing Hearts. But Kyle wasn't finished revealing the scope of his manipulation. "The private investigator you all hired? Robert Vance works for me. The dating apps where you met some of your husbands? I helped create those profiles. The coffee shop where David and Natalie had their first date? I own part of that business." The revelation that our meeting had been orchestrated was devastating. Everything we'd thought was coincidence or fate had been carefully planned by a sociopath who treated human emotions like chess pieces to be moved around for his amusement. Stephen stood up abruptly. "How long have you been watching us?" he demanded. Kyle's laughter was cold. "Long enough to know which of you would work out and which were too independent to fully commit to the role. Some of your predecessors had to be..." Discontinued. The word hung in the air like a threat. Predecessors? Tom asked. Kyle's voice became conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. You didn't think you were the first attempts, did you? Finding the right replacement takes time. Trial and error. Some men couldn't adapt to their new roles properly. The implication was terrifying. How many other men had been selected, tested, and discarded? I grabbed Natalie's arm. How many others were there before me? She wouldn't meet my eyes. Just 2, she whispered. They didn't work out. When I pressed for details, she admitted that both men had become suspicious about her behavior and ended their relationships. Kyle had advised her to try different approaches with me. Around the room, similar confessions were emerging. Each woman had gone through multiple relationships before finding their current husband. The men who'd rejected their manipulation or become suspicious had simply been abandoned, their lives disrupted for Kyle's experiment before being discarded like failed prototypes. But some of them wouldn't just go away, Kyle continued, his voice taking on a darker tone. Some of them started asking questions, threatening to expose what was happening. Those situations required more permanent solutions. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. He was talking about murder. James pulled out his phone and started dialing 911. But Kyle anticipated this. I wouldn't do that if I were you, he said, his voice turning cold. You see, there are compromising photos and videos of all your wives in situations that wouldn't look good in divorce court. Insurance fraud is also a federal crime, in case you're wondering. The threat was clear. Kyle had been blackmailing these women, probably from the beginning. Their monthly payments weren't just funding his lifestyle. They were buying his silence about their illegal activities. The life insurance fraud alone would send them all to prison, and Kyle had evidence of everything. Plus, Kyle continued, I have detailed records of every husband's daily routines, work schedules, and personal habits. Your family's safety depends on maintaining the current arrangements. Change is dangerous for everyone involved. But Tom surprised everyone by laughing. You recorded yourself admitting to insurance fraud and conspiracy, he said, holding up his phone. This entire conversation is being recorded. Your threats just became evidence. Several other men had been recording as well, and Kyle's confident demeanor finally cracked. You think you're clever, Kyle said, his voice losing its casual tone. But you have no idea how deep this goes. The police chief's daughter is married to one of my lookalikes. The district attorney's wife is in this room. You're not just fighting me. You're fighting a system I've spent years infiltrating. The scope of Kyle's operation was staggering. He hadn't just manipulated individual women. He'd identified and targeted women in positions of power or married to influential men. The support group was a network of compromised officials' wives, all under his control through blackmail and psychological manipulation. Margaret stepped forward, her face pale. Kyle promised us we could have our lives back, she said. He said if we followed his instructions, we could heal from our grief and find happiness again. We never meant to hurt anyone. But her words rang hollow in light of Kyle's admissions. You stole our identities, Stephen said, his voice shaking with rage. You turned us into puppets in your sick fantasy. 3 years of my life gone. 3 years of thinking I was loved for who I am, when I was just a consolation prize for a dead man. The call ended abruptly, but the damage was done. 12 women sat in stunned silence, realizing their dead boyfriend was alive, their grief was manufactured, and their marriages were elaborate frauds, orchestrated by a sociopath who'd been blackmailing them for years. But the confrontation wasn't over. Several of the women began turning on each other, accusations flying about who had known what and when. Linda accused Angela of recruiting her into the group. Rachel blamed Natalie for introducing her to Margaret. The carefully maintained facade of mutual support crumbled into bitter recriminations. You knew! Natalie screamed at Margaret. You knew Kyle was alive the whole time, and you let us destroy our lives for him. Margaret tried to defend herself, but the other women weren't listening. Years of suppressed doubt and guilt were exploding into rage and finger-pointing. In the chaos, Tom noticed something important. Where's your wedding ring, Margaret? He asked. She looked down at her bare left hand, and the truth became clear. Margaret wasn't Kyle's mother. She was his wife, the one person who'd known from the beginning that his death was fake. I was his first victim, Margaret said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise. Kyle tested his theories on me before he moved on to the others. He made me believe I needed him to survive, that I was nothing without him. When he decided to fake his death, he needed someone to manage his survivors. I've been his puppet master, recruiting and controlling all of you. The admission that their grief counselor had been Kyle's accomplice all along sent several women into hysterics. They'd trusted Margaret with their deepest pain, and she'd used that trust to manipulate them into Kyle's web of deceit. In the weeks that followed, the legal proceedings were swift and merciless. Kyle was arrested in Oregon and extradited to face charges of fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. But the evidence suggested his crimes went beyond financial manipulation. 3 men who had previously dated women in the support group had died in suspicious accidents over the past 5 years. The investigation revealed that Kyle had been eliminating men who posed threats to his operation. David Reeves, who had been dating Linda before Stephen, died in a hiking accident after he started asking questions about Kyle. Michael Torres, Rachel's previous boyfriend, drowned in a lake after threatening to expose what he'd learned. John Kim, Angela's former partner, died in a hit-and-run accident the day he planned to contact the police. Margaret was charged as an accessory to murder, fraud, and conspiracy. During her interrogation, she revealed the full scope of Kyle's psychological manipulation. He'd studied each woman's vulnerabilities, crafted personalized strategies for maintaining control, and eliminated anyone who threatened his operation. The women faced their own legal troubles, though most received lenient sentences in exchange for testimony against Kyle and Margaret. The insurance companies recovered most of the fraudulent payouts, but the emotional damage couldn't be quantified or repaired. Natalie's trial was particularly difficult for me to watch. Her defense attorney painted her as a victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation, while the prosecutor argued that she'd knowingly participated in fraud and conspiracy. The truth was somewhere in between. She'd been manipulated, but she'd also made choices that hurt innocent people. During her testimony, Natalie broke down as she described the pressure Kyle had put on her to find and marry a replacement. He said if I really loved him, I'd prove it by making his memory live on through someone else, she sobbed. He made me believe that loving David was the same as loving him, that I was honoring Kyle's life by living with his substitute. 6 months later, I sat in a lawyer's office signing divorce papers while Natalie cried quietly in the chair next to me. She'd lost everything, her job, her house, her identity as Kyle's grieving girlfriend, but I felt no satisfaction in her downfall. We'd all been victims of the same elaborate manipulation, and revenge couldn't give me back 3 years of my life. The other men chose different paths. Tom and Rachel went to couples therapy and somehow salvaged their marriage, though they moved to another state for a fresh start. Stephen divorced Linda immediately, but James decided to work things out with Angela after she agreed to extensive counseling and psychiatric treatment. I couldn't understand their choices, but I respected their right to make them. Some people can forgive being used as emotional substitutes. Others, like me, couldn't move past the fundamental betrayal of never being loved for themselves. Kyle was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for his crimes, but the judge noted that his psychological manipulation had caused damage that couldn't be quantified or repaired. 12 women had spent years of their lives in relationships built on lies, and 4 men had discovered their marriages were elaborate performances in someone else's twisted drama. Margaret received 10 years for her role in the conspiracy. During her final statement, she revealed one last horrifying detail. Kyle had been planning to expand his operation to other cities, using the network of compromised officials he'd created to protect himself from investigation. The arrest had stopped what could have become a nationwide conspiracy. The civil lawsuits dragged on for 2 years, with insurance companies, victims, and families of the murdered men all seeking damages. In the end, Kyle's assets were distributed among his victims, but money couldn't repair the psychological damage he'd caused. 2 years after that Thursday night confrontation, I still struggle with trusting new relationships and wonder if women are attracted to me or to some echo of a man I've never met. The face in my mirror belongs to me, but it will always carry the shadow of Kyle Thompson, a stranger whose fake death gave birth to the most complex fraud I've ever encountered. I've started a support group for men who've been used as emotional substitutes in relationships. We meet monthly at the same community center where Kyle's victims once gathered, reclaiming the space for genuine healing rather than manipulation. Stephen and James attend regularly, and we've been joined by other men who've discovered similar betrayals in their own relationships. The group has helped me understand that being chosen as a replacement doesn't diminish my worth as a person. Kyle's victims didn't fall in love with us because we were inadequate. They fell in love with us because we were good enough to carry the weight of someone else's memory. That's not our failure. It's our strength, misused by people who couldn't process their grief honestly. Sometimes the worst betrayals come from people we've never met, and healing from deception means learning to see yourself as more than someone else's replacement part. I'm still learning that lesson, but every day gets a little easier. The man in the mirror is finally starting to look like David Mitchell instead of Kyle Thompson's ghost, and that feels like victory enough.